A.W. Tozer wrote The Knowledge of the Holy with this real sense of urgency. He was convinced that modern faith had lost something absolutely vital, a true sense of God's majesty. His book is basically this powerful call to, well, look up and rediscover it. So let's get into it. What exactly did he think was lost? Why does it matter so much? And maybe most importantly, how did Tozer believe we could get it back?
And Tozer, he doesn't waste a single word. He gets right to the point, opening his book with this really arresting idea. He's arguing that it's not what we say or what we do or even what we say we believe that defines us. Nope. He says the single most important thing about any of us is our deep, inner, and often totally unexamined concept of God. For Tozer, everything else in our spiritual life just flows from that one source.
Okay, so what's the big problem Tozer is trying to solve here? He argues that modern Christianity, for all its outward successes, is actually suffering from this critical internal problem, and he gives it a name, a lost sense of majesty.
And Tozer paints this really stark contrast. He believes a kind of great trade down has happened. See, in the past, he says, the church had this high, awe-inspiring view of God, one that was just full of majesty and a real, almost tangible sense of his presence. But, he argues, the modern church has, maybe without even realizing it, swapped that out for a concept that's low, small, and frankly unworthy of the God it claims to worship.
And you gotta understand, for Tozer, this isn't just some abstract theological debate. He's not just splitting hairs for fun. He sees this low view of God as the direct cause of so many problems plaguing the church. It's like the one foundational mistake that allows 100 other problems to just sprout up. All right, so what are the real-world consequences of this low view? Why does it really matter? Well, Tozer connects it directly to the health and the vitality of our spiritual lives. And the stakes here, they're incredibly high. This isn't just about, thinking smaller thoughts about God. Tozer argues this decline has real, tangible symptoms. We lose our sense of religious awe. That conscious sense of God's presence just fades. We find ourselves unable to just be still and meet him. And worse, it becomes a breeding ground for bad doctrine, for failures in how we live our lives. And in the most extreme cases, he warns it can actually destroy the power of the gospel for the person who holds that low view. So here's the crucial point. What we believe about God isn't just a static fact in our heads. It shapes us. Tozer talks about this secret law of the soul that basically pulls us toward our mental image of God. We become like what we worship. It's that simple. A small God? It's going to produce small people. But a majestic God? Well, that produces people who start to reflect some of that majesty. Our internal picture of God, what we really think he's like, ultimately determines who we become. So, what's Tozer's prescription for this problem? Well, it's not super complicated, but it is incredibly profound. He calls for a deliberate, focused rediscovery of God's attributes. But, and this is key, he wants us to see them not as some dry theological checklist, but as the actual path back to awe and wonder. He starts with attributes that really hammer home God's absolute otherness. Let's take transcendence, for example. This is the idea that God isn't just the greatest being in the universe. He's infinitely beyond and separate from the universe. He's not just sitting at the top of the pyramid of existence. He's the one who built the whole pyramid in the first place. And this quote, wow, it just powerfully captures that infinite gap. Think about it. The distance between the highest angel and a tiny caterpillar, that's a finite distance. You could, in theory, measure it, but the distance between that same angel and God, that's infinite. See, God isn't just on a different level. He's in an entirely different category of being altogether. Next up, Tozer dives into God's sovereignty. And this is more than just God being in charge. It's about his absolute freedom to act according to his own perfect will, without being limited or constrained by anything or anyone. He is the one sole ultimate authority, period. And here, Tozer hits us with this fascinating paradox that kind of turns our usual assumptions upside down, right? We often think that God's sovereignty and our freedom, they must be in conflict. But Tozer argues the complete opposite. He says it's because God is absolutely sovereign, because he's totally in control, that he can even give us meaningful freedom in the first place. A lesser, weaker God, he'd be too afraid, too insecure to give his creatures real choice. So finally, Tozer doesn't just leave us hanging with all this high-minded theory. He wraps up his work with what he calls the open secret, which is basically a practical, straightforward guide for anyone who wants to move from just knowing about this majestic God to actually truly knowing him. And he lays out this really clear, actionable path. Step 1, it starts with personal repentance and a total commitment to Christ. Then you move on to rejecting the world's, cheap values. From there, it moves into the very practice he's been calling for this whole time: long, loving meditation on God's majesty. And finally, that inner knowledge has to flow outward into real, tangible acts of service and mercy. It's a complete vision for a transformed life. And so we end up right back where we started, with Tozer's central probing question. But now it's aimed right at us. It's an invitation to just pause, to do some of that painful self-probing he talked about, and to honestly ask ourselves, what comes into my mind when I think about God? Is it high and lofty? Or have I, maybe without even realizing it, settled for something less? And that question, Tozer believes that question changes everything.